if you want. But staying on today's seminar, so we will have two guests from Mexico. They will talk about emotions and climate activism. Why do they matter? Alice Poma, she's a researcher at the Institute for Social Research at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and she has a PhD in social sciences applied to the environment at the Pablo Lavio University of Sevilla. And that formation has been developed between different countries, in Italy, Spain, Mexico, and in England. She has been collaborating since 2007 with the Permanent Water Seminar, Territory and Environment, and since 2009 with the Red Water Lat COBASIT. She has collaborated with researchers and projects in Spain and Mexico, and she was visiting at the Instituto Universitario Europeo, the University of Guadalajara, and the University of Newcastle, and the Merida Universidad Autónoma of Puebla. Her topic of interest, as the today presentation clearly shows, are related to environmental conflicts and collective action, and particularly through the focus of the emotional dimension. And Tommaso Gravante is a researcher at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research and Humanities, also the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. He's a member of the National System of Researchers of the CONACYT. I don't know if this is the pronunciation. And he has a PhD in political science and was working in different countries and carrying out research in different countries between Italy, Spain, England, and Mexico, and collaborating with many different projects. In 2018, he was awarded with the International Prize for the Best Research for Young Sociologists of the International Sociological Association, and he's the coordinator of the Laboratory of the Activism and Alternatives of the Base. And his topic of interest also are grassroots movement and activism, and also with a special focus on the role of emotions in the activist experience. So now I will stop here because I already talked too much. I give you the floor. I don't know if you want to share I give you the. So I make you co-host so you can share the screen. And thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you here and looking forward to discuss with you this topic.
Thank you very much. Creo que I'm sharing the presentation. You can see it because I can't.
Perfect.
So, okay, now, yes. I don't know why, but yes, okay. Good afternoon to everyone in Europe. Good morning in this part of the world. And good afternoon to the cat too, Tiago. And we are Alice and Tom from Mexico, and we are presenting some findings from our research project on emotions and climate activism in Mexico City, mainly. The project started in 2019, and our data are based on participatory observation, surveys, and interviews. First, we briefly present the Mexican climate movement, and then we'll present our findings on the emotional dimension. In Mexico, environmental protests arise mostly in local conflicts, both in urban and rural areas. We are one of the most dangerous countries for environmental activists. However, climate activism has not been targeted until now. The climate movement is mostly urban and middle and upper middle class, and historical local environmental struggles have not participated. This is changing, but it will probably take longer to consolidate this new trend. Mexican climate movement is changing both because a new generation of activists have joined and because a part of the movement wants to be intersectional. The last climate strike on March 25 this year was an example of that effort. It was characterized by an anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, anti-racist, and transgender discourse. The Mexican climate movement has many challenges. As we already show, it has to face an unfavorable context, which include repression and assassinations against environmental activists, lack of pro-environmental culture, inequality, poverty, and structural violence, among others. Moreover, despite the high degree of social discontent with respect to environmental issues, there is not a structured ecologist movement in Mexico. The Mexican ecologist movement emerged and achieved its maximum visibility and cohesion in the late 80s, early 90s, during the struggle against Laguna Verde nuclear power station in the state of Veracruz. Then, after the creation of the Mexican Ecologist Green Party, which is far from green and ecologist, the movement collapsed and the term ecologist lost legitimacy and fell in disuse. In addition, in the 90s, Mexico adopted neoliberal policies, and since then, every government promoted neoliberal environmental policies. Therefore, while the popular ecologism that defends the environmental suffer repression and it is despised, even by the current leftist government, the neoliberal environmentalism is widely promoted among those who hold the economic and political power. This allows us to understand prejudices and distrust between different political subjects and the lack of participation of the struggle in defense of the environmental in the climate movement. Most participants in the climate strikes are youth in their 20s, but younger protesters between 15 and 19 years old are few. These data differ from the countries from the global north. This difference may be attributed to both. The differences in education system, strikes are not common here, and insecurity. Many parents don't allow minors to participate in demonstration. In terms of gender distribution, climate strikes involve more women than men. This confirms the result in other countries, and we can think that it also depends on the spread of the feminist movement among young students. In the last March we participated, we also detected a greater presence of no-binary young people, not only for the inclusion of LGBTQI groups in the events, but also for the tendency of young people to bisexuality and not to recognize themselves as men or women. Let's introduce how we study emotions. We rely on the emotions and protest field of social movement studies that consider emotions as social cultural constructions. We also believe that just the theory of action is a strong tool to understand many internal and external dynamics of protest and social movements. For instance, Jasper typologies allow to identify different emotions based on their characteristics, such as object, time, intensity. So when we analyze the emotional dimension of activism, we first identify the most relevant emotion activists feel, and then we analyze their impacts on activism and how all these emotions interact among them. For instance, we can observe how a mood like hope can be strengthened by reciprocal emotion among activists or affective commitments toward children. Moving on to research techniques, the surveys allow us to identify common partners and corroborate hypotheses. And the interviews allow us to understand how emotions are socially constructed. This means why and how everyone feels what he feels and how he interprets and manages it. Finally, we believe not only that emotions are an important dimension of action, but also a tool in the political contention. For this reason, we offer workshops to activists through which they can know and appropriate themselves the knowledge we generate. This allows us to deepen our research results and generate an impact in activism. When we refer to emotional dimension of climate activism, we are not referring only to the emotion felt during climate strikes, but also emotion generated by climate change, the ones generated in the internal dynamics of the organizations and groups of the climate movement, the emotion linked to expectation towards what other actor, the one that influence strategy, and finally, the emotional management of all above emotions. We will now present just some of our findings about the emotions that characterize climate activism in Mexico. In this table, in Spanish, we have resumed the most relevant emotion that we could observe in 2019 and 2020. As you can see, the emotional dimension encompasses a broad matrix of emotions. In this case, we have organized them by dividing those that are generated by climate change and those that activists feel in collective and political actions. One of our findings is that the emotions generated by climate change are mostly unpleasant. Other unpleasant emotions are generated by conflicts, internal and external, or in the relationship with other actors, authorities, but also people who don't act. Pleasant emotions are generated in collective actions and serve to overcome unpleasant ones. Among the pleasant emotions, reciprocal emotions stand out. In terms of mobilizing emotion, we can say that both pleasant and unpleasant emotions can mobilize. Worry is a moral emotion that characterizes climate activism, together with anger and indignation. Powerlessness also can mobilize when it is shared and when it is associated with anger and not resignation. Sharing emotions, both pleasant and unpleasant, is also important because feeling the same emotion unites activists and participants and helps them to feel less alone. An example of what just said is the data on worry obtained from the last survey. When we asked in interviews what climate activists feel about people who are not worried and not acting against climate change, the activists expressed several unpleasant emotions such as anger, frustration, despair, powerlessness, among others. In the last survey, we also wanted to ask how many felt anxiety linked to the climate emergency. These findings confirm many recent psychological researches on climate or eco-anxiety in young people. In addition to eco-anxiety, activists also feel anxiety about doing political practice. The possible failure of an action or a strategic decision, such as pulling for intersectionality, generates anxiety in the organizers. In the same way that first-time participants feel anxiety when participating in a march. Another emotion that the climate emergency generates in activists is emotional pain, also called climate grief or sorrow. This is also a moral emotion since it is generated by witnessing the degradation and destruction of the ecosystems. Interviews show that climate pain is associated with the concept of climate injustice, since it's felt due to the impact on the most vulnerable beings, whether human or not human. Climate pain is also built by becoming aware of the role of human beings in the degradation of the environment due to the lack of response from society and due to the attacks or prejudices toward their struggle. And here we put some extract from the interviews. The surveys applied in 2020 and 2022 highlight how the pandemic has affected emotion on climate activism. The mood is less optimistic than in 2019. There is less hope, for example, but moral emotion, for example, worry and anger, have increased. While the pandemic prevented climate activism from escalating after the hugely successful of 2019 climate actions, all organizations in Mexico have continued to work to strengthen and prepare new strategies and actions. This was observed in the climate strike of March 25, in the recent Art and Environment Festival, from the construction of a popular ecological assembly by young activists, and many other initiatives. Anger and indignation are moral emotions that are felt in the climate movement when perceiving injustice and are directed mainly towards other social actors. Our research indicates that anger is felt by most climate activists, but with different intensity, depending on whether they are more or less radical. Some Mexican activists, especially from the upper classes, repress their anger in the hope they will be more successful. Other historical repressed actors express their anger about the impacts of climate change affecting the poorest and most vulnerable population, framing the climate emergency as a colonialist problem created by industrialized countries. Let's finish with hope. Our data show that climate activists' hope lies in the ability of society to face the problem, and not in the techno-optimism. Hope as a pleasant mood is linked to reciprocal emotion and the alternatives and actions carried out in the movement, and not the authorities that should be acting to deal with the problem. This hope in collective action is linked in young activists with the pride and satisfaction that goes with climate action. Likewise, we were able to verify that young activists generate hope in older activists. To conclude, we can summarize some of our results. First, climate activists feel more unpleasant emotion than pleasant. This makes us understand how much it can be tough to participate in this movement and the need to manage those emotions in order not to get depressed and give up the fight. Second, pleasant emotions are felt in collective action and towards people who feel the same and act against climate change. Third, both pleasant and unpleasant emotions can mobilize and strengthen collective identity. Sharing and managing emotions can become political actions, since help creating bond among activists and avoiding burnout. The next stage of the research involves doing more in-depth interviews to find out how climate activist emotions are socially constructed. The aim of the second stage of the research will be to corroborate if moral emotions such as anger characterize radical activists, to identify the emotion that people who prioritize climate justice feel, to know how activists are dealing with uncomfortable emotion, to know the collective and strategic emotional management strategies that activists are developing. We want to close this presentation by highlighting that studying the emotional dimension of climate activism is not relevant only in the field of social movements. With our research, we believe that we can enrich the literature on emotion and protest, but also we can help to develop new strategies to enhance the social response of climate emergency. To do this, we need to understand what people feel about climate change and how these feelings influence their action. Our approach to emotions considers that what we feel, think, and act are inseparable. And the climate emergency as a social problem must be faced, including its emotional dimension. We thank everyone who have listened to us. We hope that you have been able to understand our pronunciation. and that our results and our perspective on emotions have been interesting for you. You can contact us to receive articles and chapters in English. You can also find us on ResearchGate, and the Spanish speakers can follow us in our laboratory on activism and grassroots alternatives. And we put the webpage here. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe you can close the, okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Alice and Tommaso, for this very interesting presentation. So now we move to the question and answers session that will be moderated by Tiago. So,
yes, and thank you for the presentation, Alice and Tommaso. Yeah, so should we go to the questions? Who is there? Anyone with questions? I'm trying to change my screen. So
yeah,
if you want to write or raise your hand.
Questions, comments, they are welcome in both in English and Spanish.
And Italian as well.
If nobody is, Lara.
Lara.
Oh, hello, thank you very much, Alice. It's just a quick question, actually. I was wondering if the survey was conducted on, maybe I just missed in the beginning, only on the demonstrations on the streets or on specific social movements in Mexico? It's just really a technical question.
Yeah, the 2019 survey and 2022 was in the climate strikes. The 2020 survey wasn't because there was a pandemic, so we decided to do a survey to activists in order to know the impact of the pandemic, how they were living the pandemic. And we have a lot of data of this survey because in Mexico there were a lot of more dead people than in other country, like European country. So 30% of the activists lose someone in the pandemic. So the emotional impact of the pandemic was strong. So we decided to do these different surveys, and these 3 years of the research have to adapt to the pandemic. So even the interviews in 2020 were online. And we hope now this year, we want to do the interview presentially. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara and Alice. Anyone else? Paula?
Sorry, the sun is hitting me. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Alice and Tommaso. This was very interesting, and I find your work with the emotions regarding climate change and climate change activism very interesting and important. I'm going to be following it. But right now I have a question on a topic that you approached very quickly, and in regards of which I'm very interested, which is the topic of climate change narratives being linked with colonialism in Mexico and being abstract. These were the words you used in the slide, and I would like to hear you a little bit more about them.
Yes, I will try in English. If you don't understand me, please let me know.
No, I'm sure I will understand.
At the beginning, climate change narrative in Mexico is the mainstream narrative. So in 2019, Fridays for Future young activists are including the European or United States narrative in their struggle. What changed is that during the pandemic, they spent 2 years in order to discuss how the movement will go in Mexico. And since the beginning in 2019, there were a lot of internal conflicts in the climate movements between, in order to say it very basic, rich people, poor people, students from private university, students from public university, and the popular ecologist or environmental movement never enter in the climate movement until now. During the pandemic, young activists, but everyone really, start to discuss this kind of conflicts and start to change narratives. So we had another project on narratives, on climate change narrative in Mexico. So we could see the changing in these narratives. And the first time we see these new narratives, anti-colonialist, more explicitly anti-capitalist, was in 2022, as 2 weeks ago. So it was a new trend that we saw, and we could speak with the young activists that were protagonists in the discussion and betting on intersectionality and anti-colonialism. And they were very anxious about the results of the march. A lot of people, or some people, wasn't so happy from the change, because in 2019, the last march, it was well participated. In Mexico, environmental protests are few. There are not a lot of participation because of the violence and the repressions and the fear of repression and disappearance. So 6,000 people in a march on environmental issue is a lot in Mexico. And in this last march, there were 200 people. It was very different from the narrative, the emotional climate, and for the second time really, there was people from original villages in Mexico City that participate in this march. So it is the first time we could see the participation of popular environmentalism in climate activism. And but there were conflict even in the march, for example, between anti-racist groups and vegan, for example, because in some, not for values really, but for, I don't know if we could read the last book of Arlie Hochschild, Strangers in Their Own Land. No. She studied Tea Party followers in Louisiana, and she explains how some people, conservative people, saw other people, Black people, women, or even non-human animals as a threat for the ride to American dream. And here is a little the same. Anti-racist people, the Black community in Mexico, for instance, is living repression and invisibility, and sometimes feel bad that animals, non-human animals, can be put before them. So this was the conflict in this case, and there are a lot of this type of conflicts. So they called in Mexico the upper classes Mexican people are white Mexicans, and anti-colonialist, anti-racist groups, organization, and people are against this kind of whiteness of Mexican even social movements.
Mhm.
So this climate change narrative, anti-colonialist, even anti-capitalist, anti-racist, is something that they are building, but in a quite complicated context and quite conflictive context. So we think that it takes longer to consolidate this narrative and to see if other organization groups accept this narrative.
Okay. Thank you, Elise. I understood. I understand now the situation a little bit better. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Paula, and thank you, Elise. We have someone wrote a question, and I'm probably going to mispronounce her name. Ewan wrote. I don't know if you want to come and read your question. If not, probably not. But he says, he asks you, Elise and Tommaso, hey, thank you for the interesting presentation regarding hope. You describe it as a pleasant mood, rested mainly to collective action. In Belgium, participants would often, somewhat reluctantly, hope that the government will listen to them. Did you find any such external hopes in the Mexican movement? And if so, how did they dealt with it?
About the hope that the government would listen to them, no. In the 2019 survey, we asked for the trust in democracy, in the government, and also in the hope that the government could act and listen to them. And I think 40% believe it with restriction, and 60% say absolutely not. So nor government nor enterprises are seen for the majority of the people in the movement as the actors who will act. And as we show, environment policies in Mexico are mainly neoliberal. And even this actual government, this is a lefty government, is a 70s view of the world, and is investing in carbon fusel foil. And the problem is we are a poor country and we have fuel, petrol. I don't know. And yes. And what the government is doing is try to become independent energetically from US. So the government can do it not now, with alternative energies. So we are also in the middle of a big structural and political change in the electrical law. And the idea is not to allow external corporation, so mainly European and in the United States corporation, to invest in energies in order to become independent. And it's a very historical struggle in Mexico, this one, to become independent energetically and in all kinds of resources. So really no government has acted toward climate justice, because the neoliberal policies are improve climate mitigation and adaptation, but from a bottom-up view and very unequal. And the leftist government is betting on energetical independence. So there is no government that can act toward a climate emergency from a perspective of climate justice. So the climate movement really don't have a partner in government and nor in the enterprises.
Thank you.
So
I don't
no
know
hope.
if so no hope. I don't know if you want to ask something else. No, I turned off the camera, so I'm guessing no. But if you want to, please go ahead. Do you have any other questions or comments?
I have the.
Guya? I didn't see your hand. Sorry.
No problem. If there isn't anyone else. Okay.
Not that I can see.
Well, we'll have many questions, but we can also discuss more in the future, of course, because this is a super fascinating topic, and your research is very interesting. And I really like it also the implicit comparison between pre-COVID and post-COVID conditions. So that it was also the topic of Lorenzo in the past seminar. So he focused on this aspect, and even if this wasn't exactly the focus, the real focus of your study, I understand, but there were some implicit reflections around this. And what also when you were answering to Paula a question about the narratives, I had the impression that you were saying that the COVID time also, okay, with this anxiety and the problem that the issues that they're very difficult to rise it, but was also a moment for reflection. So it opened a kind of gave some time, like an more extended time for reflection, far from the pressure of street activism. So that the fact that we all know that activism is a very demanding task. The activists need to be always, well, it's a big part of life, especially for activists that they are not paid. Like in some cases in the United States, we have professional activists, they have a salary to be an activist, an organizer, let's say. But I don't think it's the same in Mexico, as particularly in this case, as is not in Europe. So they are like kind of people with their families, their jobs and studies, etc. And activism is an extra activity that is very demanding emotionally, in terms of time, and many respects. So what emerged, for instance, in the Lorenzo presentation, it was that the pandemic also gave a kind of room for consolidating the reflection, and this can be interesting from what you say about these converging narratives. There are conflictual narratives and also memory, I can imagine, about what you were mentioning about the colonialism, post-colonial narrative, and the new, let's say, the new form, kind of what you say, more white and issues like veganism and these things. So this kind of building a common narrative, if the pandemic was a moment for this. And if you had something more to say about this, about the role of pandemic as an opportunity also to reshape this reflection. And my other question is about the levels of the different levels of the engagement. So of course the emotions are at the individual level, at the micro level of activists. and how this, in my research, I really, well, there is always, they are always really shaped by the organization. I found a very strong influence from on the side of the network, on the way the emotions were translated to the others in a certain way, a kind of the group, the emotion of the group, I mean, different input are different framed by different groups. And how the group, actually the meso level of the group, of the network, actually work really as a mediation between what happened at the macro level of the politics, contextual situation, and sorry if I'm extending too much my question, but my point is, we know that being an activist in Mexico, in particular climate change, a climate activist, is not the same of being an activist of the same kind of topic in Europe. For surely, is also much more risky activity. So this is for sure. But I think maybe the role of the networks, of the groups, also mediated this historical, this contextual condition. So I don't know if it's clear. Well, but I stop here and.
Tom, you want to say no? Okay. First, COVID. What you say is true, absolutely. We start researching the impact of pandemic because the situation in Mexico was very painful and sad. And but we also could see many, digamos, positive aspects of the reaction of social movement in the pandemics. So a book that we edited it will be published soon about the experience of solidarity during the pandemic from social movements, and climate movement was included. So some climate organization during the pandemic start not only to consolidate themselves and reflect about narrative things and strategies, etc., but also organizing solidarity and giving food to people who can't allow that. In the pandemic in Mexico, 60% of Mexican people are poor and informal workers. So during the pandemic, there was no statal head, no social aid. So a lot of family didn't have to eat. So this was the emergency, no? Social emergency and sanitary emergency. And for the youngest activists who didn't went to the streets, didn't organize in this way, they stayed at home and use their time to know them, each other better, to reflect, read, for example, books or information on climate movements or social movements in general. We did an online course on emotion and activism during the pandemic with young activists. They ask activities in order to stay active, doing something and prepare for when the pandemic will be ended. So, and another data that we have is that during the pandemic was useful to highlight the neoliberal consequences on alimentation, and Mexico is one of the countries with most diabetic and obese fat people, and so the high level of mortality in Mexico is related to that. And so the same government said that we need to change, or Mexican need to change their alimentary habits. So a lot of people trying to change their habits during the pandemic, both young people and adults. A lot of the food that was distributed to poor people during the pandemic, in many cases was vegan. So social movements try to not only distribute food, but also try to influence people in order to gain conscience the water they are drinking and eating. And so yes, pandemic, COVID time was a very difficult timing, a lot of people dying, a lot of here the health system is clearly different from Europe, and public hospitals were saturated totally, and the private hospitals are very, very, very expensive. 25,000 euros for enter with COVID. If you have COVID, there is a fee to enter in a private hospital. And 25,000 euro are a lot for Mexican normal people. So people were afraid to getting ill because they can afford to get ill. And because the mortality was very high. And so there was a reflection even in values and priorities. And this has influenced also activism, because before only the popular ecologist or environmental movement was defending life itself. No? And with the pandemic, a lot of more people, even in middle class, could see that life is threatened by capitalism. So there was a reflection and a reprioritization of values around life, around the role of capitalism or neoliberal system in life. And this is the first answer. The second one, about if the network mediate emotions. Emotions are social constructed. So emotions are the results of biography, memories, as we say, education, and also social interaction. So in the organization and in the groups, activists are sharing their emotion in the most positive cases. And in this, they are sharing emotion and building, constructing emotions. It's not happening, this is not happening in all social movements, because emotion have been treated like a taboo in many social movements, not only in society. So the most orthodox Marxist groups don't like to speak about emotion. But for example, young activists in the climate movement are very sensitive to this issue. So in Fridays for Future, for instance, in Fridays for Future Mexico, for instance, they start every meeting asking how they feel. And there is a lightning, green, yellow, red, for the moods at the beginning, and at the end, they end the meeting asking how they feel, because they don't want the meetings empeorar, peggiorare.
Worsening.
The meeting worsening their emotion and moods. Thank you. And the same, we see that young activists are more sensitive on emotion, more sensitive or on non-binary decision, election, etc. They are betting on intersectionality, and there is some kind of resistance from other generation of the activists. More mediated emotion. For instance, we have some examples how networks mediate emotion. Not really the organization itself, because we work with informal organizations, really. So there is literature that show that formal organization can mediate emotion in a structural way, as Oakshield show for airlines, for instance. But in our case, informal network, what are doing is try to understand the emotion of others. Sometimes activists suppress some emotions that can worsening or the fight, the struggle. And there are also like ethical commissions when some activists express that they are feeling bad for anything other activists are saying or are doing. So they are taking this issue very seriously, and for the collective dimension of the emotional dimension is very, very important. Is spontaneous until now, and this was a discussion in the social movement literature. Deborah Gould, in her research on ACT UP, showed that a lot of time, for instance, emotional management is spontaneous in social movements. It could be strategic, yes. We want to understand deeply when, if there are strategic strategies, organization strategies in the climate movement. But now what we are observing that is spontaneous, that young people mainly are taking it seriously, and they are asking us to help them in order to understand how they can do, and how the understanding of the emotional dimension can help even their activism.
Okay, thank you, Ligia.
No,
Thank you. Any other question or comments? Okay, if not, maybe I can do one as well. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I was thinking about a few questions. Some of them were already asked, but I was mainly thinking, one of my questions is how does, I'm doing this project side gig with Pete Gardner, who is attending here as well, on transnational diffusion of XR, and we've been working on that, and we actually presented back in December in the same seminar, which was a lovely excuse to bring Pete to Lisbon. And we've been working on that, and some of our findings are sort of similar to, and we've worked also on how do they portray the future and so on. So we kind of find a lot of hope and anger and a lot of catastrophism in their discourses. But at the same time, I was thinking about another question here, which has to do with, you know, how do you have data on how does Mexico compares with other Latin American countries? First of all, because the what you bring resonates somehow with some things that we see also in Europe with young people. Then how did this movement, because we see this global wave, do you have idea of how was these, you know, ideas from XR and climate and Fridays for Future, yes, arrived in Mexico, and how did they mix with already existing frameworks, repertoires, and narratives? Because we've done some interviews with people from New Zealand. It was really interesting to see the mix of already existing protest cultures and movement cultures in New Mexico with what was coming from these movements. And first, and to finish here, is what is the net? Are these guys embedded in the network of actors, or they do act? You know, you refer to women's movement and so on, but for instance, I was thinking, you talked about the old Marxists, the Orthodox Marxists that don't like to talk about their feelings. But for instance, how do they relate with the Zapatistas? Is there any connection between the two? And that's it. So now, thank you for the very interesting talk.
Thank you. Thanks, Tiago. First question about the data on Latin American countries. We have few. We know what the Mexican activists are doing with Latin American activists, because there is a network between them. So we are aware about that. We have some information about that. But the climate movement is not a issue that the Latin American academic is seeing interesting. As climate movement is seen as something that it's European and or from the United States. So the country where massive participation was Argentina, which we can see as the more European country of the continent. There were protests in Brazil and other countries, but the real network is among environmental resistances, and it's huge. So we don't have other colleagues in Latin America who are studying the climate movements and less the emotional climate movements. There are a lot of colleagues in Latin American who are studying the emotional dimension at the moment, but in other movements, and so not in climate movements. About how the global wave entered in Mexico was very complicated for what I just said. Because it's perceived like something that is colonialist or from the white countries or industrialized or rich countries. So there is in Mexico, like in any country, I think, a sort of idealism of industrialized countries, and people from middle upper classes or upper classes feel more nearest to Europe or in United States than Mexico. And so in this case, at the beginning, for instance, Fridays for Future Mexico was called Fridays for Future. So there were a lot of discussion inside and conflict, and now it's called Viernes por el Futuro in Spanish. They changed the name in Spanish because a lot of people felt that call it in English was from outside, was an imposition even. So in 2019, when there were a lot of visibility, the Great Effect and everything, the global wave entered as a global wave. In the pandemic, it was reframed, and now we are seeing the results. But it's soon to see how they have achieved to change, or how many people can left the movement because of this changing. So they are beating on intersectionality and in the inclusion of popular environmentalism, because it's the majority of the country that could enter in the climate movement. But I think that can leave the movement if these narratives is spread. And it's the same with the relation with Zapatistas movement. At the beginning, we can interview some young activism, and among young activists, there are some people who don't know what is Zapatism in Mexico. So, and there are other peoples, young people, students even, who don't like Zapatism. So at the beginning, there were a lot of conflict for the integration of other social movements, including Zapatism. The Zapatist movement in the last years has changed his narratives about environment, and is resisting a lot of projects against the environment. It was not the same at the beginning of the Zapatist movement, but now he has joined the popular environmental resistances. But this part of environmentalism or ecologism in Mexico is not present in the climate movements. So when Zapatist movement organized marches, actions, etc., for the environment, climate movements don't participate. Only individuals can participate, but not the climate movements. So there is a lot of work to do in order to find a connection. But Zapatist movement is very near to environmental resistance now. So we could do an integration, but it depends on the development of climate movement.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting to think that, as you were saying, that the Zapatistas, some people in the environmental movement in Mexico don't know who the Zapatistas are, when they were so emblematic for well, I don't know if we have more questions. What happened?
I could add that there is a lot of racism.
Okay. I somehow lost my.
Alice, we say something more. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
No, that was my problem. I had a technical problem. Sorry.
Move on.
It's normal. It's normal with Zoom. Don't worry. No, there are racism towards Chiapas, where there is the Zapatist movement. Is an indigenous Zapatist movement is an indigenous movement. There is a lot of racism in Mexico. So for this reason, it was so important to see anti-racist groups in the last march of climate movements. But it's a quite complicated issue here because it's embodied and it's part of society. So for this reason, we as European or born in Europe, people born in Europe, we know Zapatism, how Europe sees Zapatism, but in Mexico it's totally different. Even the leftist government is against Zapatism. So is against Zapatism, actually. So in reality, in Mexico, Zapatism now is quite isolated and related to what here we are called the autonomous left or leftist groups. So there is a new wave in the last 10, 15 years, a new wave of social movements. They call themselves as autonomous, and there are a lot of rural and depends on the state, indigenous community who decided to self-organize their territory. So no parties, no political parties, no political parties, no police. No state police, communities, villages, autonomous are connected with what we call the popular environmental movements, the resistances in the territories, both in urban area and in rural area. So there are a lot of this kind of, like 500 environmental conflicts at the moment in Mexico with this kind of characteristic, and they are dissociated with climate movement. And because of the neoliberal characteristic of environment politics in the last decades, and even in the climate policies, no? The climate policies in Mexico are neoliberal policies. So this complicated.
But Alice, just focusing on this, about repression, state repression, but political violence, we heard from Europe that it's very, very difficult, particularly against environmental activists and ecologist activists. And this violence is mostly, I think, mostly against this, what you call a popular environmental movement, no? Okay, so what's the reaction?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely, the people killed are normally indigenous or rural people, and from the bottom of the society, no the upper classes. So yes, absolutely is a classist and racist too issue.
May I still ask a question?
Sure.
I'm wondering about what type of conflicts were you mentioned there were many hundreds of conflicts going on. What would be the topic of those conflicts? Can you give us some examples?
Yes, a lot of conflicts are to defending forests, for instance, because there. But we have a lot of problem in Mexico. One is narco. You understand in English, sure. Narco?
Yes.
Okay, narcotraffic. So narcotraffic is working on rural area, and for instance is sembrar
seems
aguacate.
Seems like an avocado.
Sembrar aguacate, cultivar aguacate, yes. Avocado. What is in English?
Avocado.
Avocado.
Yes, like a lot of avocados, a lot of hectares, and they are destroying the forests for that. So communities are defending forests from fires in order to build urbanizations, or for water. We have a lot of problem with water in Mexico City. We follow a conflict in the city against a construction enterprise who destroyed
in Spanish.
Another conflict that we follow was against water pollution, because we have two rivers very polluted, and people are dying causing for the pollution. There are also a lot of conflicts in the coast of Mexico for the construction of hotels, and touristic land to people there. Mines, a lot of mines, mainly from Canadians mines. And mines, we have a lot of lithium. So now
you have lithium.
Of the tissue.
Yeah, sure.
We have a lot of natural resources.
I see. But lithium is going to be a big issue, of course, with the electric cars. Thank you. I understand. Any examples that you have of successful conflicts? Conflicts in which the people against
there are few, there are not a lot, but there is a state, Oaxaca state, in the south of between Mexico City and Chiapas, where the majority of municipality are independent. In Oaxaca, in the state, some indigenous community want have and because a changing in the government, in the state or federal government, or a new enterprise that arrives can become a new threat. So even when they win, they stay alert normally.
They should. Yeah. Thank you, Alice.
Well, my connection at Iscte is really terrible. I think I disappeared. Sorry.
We
Now,
see you. We see you. Guya, we see you.
No, now.
But it's true that you disappeared for a tiny bit, but my connection is not better as well. I'm also suffering a lot of breaks. But I heard everything. That's good. I don't know. Do we have any other questions or comments? If like the weather is beautiful in Lisbon, if you were in Lisbon, we would gladly invite you for a beer and tremoços. I don't know if you know what it is, but yeah, exactly. But
next time.
If not, can you hear me well? Because
yeah.
Okay. So I was saying, I don't know if Alice and Tommaso want to add something.
Well, no, I'm sorry. I did speak in this conference, but Alice have a better fluent English than me. But we we do the same research together. We share the same findings and opinions.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us,
Yes.
for listening to us, for the patience for our English.
No.
Really, there
Oh.
are many years that we could speak English. I think 70 here without speaking English. So we can read, but speaking is other things. So really, thank you very much for the.
No, it was great. It was great to have you here, really. Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you for joining us and keep in touch. Thank you
Yeah.
also to everybody for participating and for the questions and the comments. Okay, thank you a lot.
And yeah, and we'll see you the 11th of May, not at the regular time.
At 10 in the morning.
4 or 5 p.m., but at 10 a.m. because we have someone from Sydney.
And you will find
and,
the record of this session on our YouTube channel.
Yeah. And we'll have a next talk about Ukraine and Europeanization and transnational globalization, and then another one about COVID and housing activism in Lisbon, and then the last one of this academic year will be on populism by Luca Manucci, but we'll come up with the details very, very, very soon. We're just finalizing them. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again, Alice and Tommaso, and see you very soon as well. I don't know if you want to add anything, Guya?
No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Well,
Bye.
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 Oh. Aspetta che... Ah.
Sta registrando ancora?